Today I'm going to be looking at a classic. I'm going to take you right back to 1995 and the World Championship match between Viswanathan Anand, the challenger, and Garry Kasparov, who at that time was the world champion. This match was held in New York, actually at the top of the World Trade Center. And this match has, for me, great memories actually. I was there as TV commentator and journalist. I was reporting on the match. And, well, this game I want to look at is game 13. At this moment, in the middle of the match, Kasparov had a 1-point lead. He was 6.5, 5.5 ahead. And they just had a series of games. Kasparov, where Anand had actually won game 9. Kasparov had struck back in game 10 and then won in game 11 as well. So Kasparov won ahead, but you know they'd been trading blows and the game was really catching fire. Game 13 turned out to be a real turning point in the match, and well, that's the game I'd like to look at now. Okay, without further ado, let's crack on. Anand had the white pieces. He played his customary pawn to e4, and Kasparov repeated the opening that he'd played a couple of games before. Sicilian defense, you can see that. He repeated the dragon variation. Now this was a huge surprise. Kasparov's great speciality throughout his career was the Najdorf variation, an opening that many of you will know I have a great fondness for. And playing the dragon variation, a very controversial variation, was a massive surprise. And Anand had lost 2 games previously as white against the variation, and well, he'd clearly cooked something up for this game. Well, let's see what he tried. Already that's a little bit unusual. That invites black to play knight g4 and reaching a slightly unusual position there, but Kasparov continued in very orthodox fashion, and now they've transposed to a very normal position. This is the so-called Yugoslav variation, Yugoslav attack, I should say, of the dragon. White plays pawn to f3 and tries at some moment, usually, to storm black on the king side. I mean, there are various ways of playing this. You don't have to commit the bishop to c4. You can also play g4 and h4 before then. But okay, you could say certainly in the mid-90s, this was the main line of the dragon. And now, in game 11, Anand had castled. Okay, this is absolutely standard. He plays something slightly different, h4. And now black can allow the pawn to move to h5, but Kasparov blocked with h5, and at that time this was kind of the main line. And rook c8. Okay, so black intends building up pressure on the c file. This is absolutely standard, and knight e5 is coming. It's very normal. Now the main line, for example, runs castles queenside, knight e5. I mean, this is hugely theoretical. There have been many games played from this position. It was first thought that maybe g4 was perhaps a bust of this line. Then bishop h6 was found to be interesting, but bishop g5 is kind of the main line, and then rook c5 with the idea of sometimes doubling on the c5, sometimes queen a5, sometimes preparing b5. But this was kind of the main move here, and it's highly complex. But here Anand chose to play something that is a real sideline. He played knight takes c6. Now if bishop takes c6, trying to keep the c file open, the bishop is not well placed on c6. Then you can castle and go for your kingside attack, and black's queenside play on the c file is very slow indeed. So after knight c6, black has to play b takes c6. Positionally, this is a very desirable move anyway. it covers the d5 square. Often the d5 square is a problem for black in the dragon. It's slightly weak. So here white can never play the knight into d5, not in this position at any rate. So play is going to switch to the semi-open b file probably. Now bishop h6, but I mean positionally it's not brilliant for white to exchange on c6, but it does mean that for just for a moment black's queenside play is slowed, so it's not so bad. c5 played by Kasparov. Okay, looks pretty normal. You want to play c4, and this kind of drags the bishop back here, which means that now the b file is open, black can try to generate play there. So Anand has exchanged off the dangerous bishop on g7. This was a good idea. And now he plays b3. I think if white wanted to play more aggressively here, you could just castle straight away. So that's possible. But okay, Anand played more steadily with b3. So he's keeping his options open. I don't think it's a bad idea. Now I really like Kasparov's next move, because it's not clear exactly where black's play is coming from in this position. On the queen side, everything seems to be closed. Center is very well controlled by white. This square is under control. So where is black playing? But Kasparov's next move I think is excellent. Bishop e6, and this really loosens white's grip on the queen side actually. So black is inviting the exchange, and these double pawns actually don't matter so much. I mean, one thing is this pawn controls the d5 square, takes away the potential square for the knight on d5, and that clump of pawns is actually terribly strong, and there is later possibility to generate play on the f file. This knight could easily switch around again at some later point to e5, but more pressingly black can open up the c file with c4. This is the real point, of course. So I don't think white should take on e6, Anand, but of course allowing the pawns to be doubled also doesn't look terribly inviting. So Anand therefore played knight d5. Looks like a reasonable move. Kasparov took with the bishop, and pawn takes. So the structure has changed. White would very much like to try to generate play on the e file. So it's still possible to castle on the queen side, and then perhaps double on the e file, perhaps try to break open the king side with g4. This is the key move for white in this position. And white looks pretty secure on the queen side as well. It's going to be very hard to break through here. But Kasparov's next move was excellent. He played e5. Now, I think if white had been able to castle queenside, generate play on the e file, this could be quite an interesting position. But after e5, now this is rather unsettling for white, because this potential weakness on e7 has disappeared. Now, Anand should probably just castle here anyway. But of course the position isn't so great now that there's no target here. But I think white is solid enough on the queen side. There is perhaps the potential later on to play g4. But I think the position is pretty finely balanced. If black plays a5, then you can block with a4, and there is no really serious danger on the queen side. This is what Anand should play, and the position is roughly balanced. But clearly Anand didn't want to leave this pawn on e5. It felt like he'd lost something strategically with allowing this pawn to advance to e5, so he took on e6, but this was too casual. I think he was probably hoping that after this perhaps the bishop just nudges back to d3, and there's potential play on the king side. You know, black's king only has 2 pawns in front of it. You know, these squares are a little bit weak. That would be a playable position for white. But here's the shocker. Instead of recapturing after this en passant capture, Kasparov very quickly lashed out with d5. I remember watching the game at this moment, and Kasparov was kind of bristling now. You know, he played d5 so quickly and confidently. And this is a very strong move. The pawn can't be taken. Let's just have a very quick look at that. Bishop takes pawn, loses. The bishop is pinned to the queen, and if you play c4, then you win the bishop. So bishop takes pawn loses. So therefore the bishop has to retreat. And now, I mean, I think Anand must have just overlooked this, you know, assuming black would have to recapture. And now, if the pawn you know, if you play pawn takes, well, things, you know, aren't so bad. You can castle here, and well, I mean, I like black's pawn center. You know, this looks very attractive, but things aren't so bad for white. But after bishop e2, Kasparov found an excellent move. He played c4. He said after the game, I've never played one move that prevented castling on both sides of the board. So obviously that's not possible. The queen prevents, and castling queenside, well, that means the c file opens and you just win a pawn there. So yeah, he said, yeah, here we go. Kasparov remarked, the first time in my life that I prevented castling on 2 wings with 1 move. Now white has to be extremely careful with the king caught in the middle. For example, if you play pawn takes pawn, then black is ready to double on the e file, and this looks pretty dreadful. It was suggested after the game, let me just go back, that perhaps Anand should play rook d1 with the idea of blocking on d4. I mean, I think there are a couple of attractive continuations for black. You could play c3 and simply pawn takes and play with this strong centre. Not a bad continuation, but perhaps the most dynamic is rook e8. And if pawn takes pawn, let me see, pawn takes pawn, rook takes, and you're ready to double. So probably white should play queen d4. Well, again, black has a very, very nice initiative here. Just preparing to double. I mean, maybe white plays something like king here, but it doesn't look very attractive. I mean, black is certainly, well, has the initiative. But c3 was a dreadful move. After this, white's king is really getting caught in the middle. Of course, you can take this pawn, but as I said, this actually helps black to increase the pressure. Anand took on c4. Rook takes, and this is already really nasty. If pawn takes pawn, rook e5, again you're just threatening to double on the e file. Let's just go through a variation. I remember Kasparov showing these variations after the game. He was impressed by his own play. He loved this position. It's typical Kasparov. Now here, see, the king can't castle, and the knight is ready to come in on e4 or g4, and all black's pieces are working. It's terrible. So Anand played king f1. Of course, it doesn't really help. So the bishop is attacked. Bishop d3, takes, and now a killer move to finish, knight e4, and after this Anand actually resigned the game. Let's take a look. The queen is attacked, knight g3, mate is also threatened. So if pawn takes knight, check, it all happens very easily, check. And queen f2. Let's just finish that. If queen takes rook, then rook here wins the queen. and after knight e4, if queen e1, well, let's say rook here, threatening knight d2 check, and this is also absolutely fatal. So a devastatingly short victory for Kasparov in that game, in game number 13. So that gave him a 2-point lead in the match. Now the match was over 20 games, but so there was still time for Anand to recover. However, losing such a game left Anand really crushed, and he really never recovered after that in the match, and Kasparov wound up a pretty easy winner. I think this match in 1995 came too soon for Anand. He'd fought his way through to be the challenger, and deservedly so, but at that time he lacked experience in these matches which Kasparov had, and Kasparov, I think, at that time was really at the height of his powers. I think if they played 5 years later on, it would have been a very different story, and it's a pity that we never got to see another Anand-Kasparov World Championship match. I know that Kasparov had enormous respect for Anand's abilities, in particular his calculating speed. So there we go. Thanks very much for watching. Do subscribe if you're not a subscriber already, and see you soon on this YouTube channel.